Welcome to the Suicide Prevention Show here on 1360 WLBK, a show that tries to shed a little light on the darkness of suicide. With us, as always, from the great state of Michigan, Tamara Sutton. Tamara, how you doing, my dear?
I'm great. I'm so happy to be here with all of you. Thank you.
And we're always happy to have you here. You can always contact Tamara at tamarasutton.com. Chuck Seabrass, Mr. Seabrass, how are you doing, sir?
I'm doing great, and as always, I'm thankful to be here and be a part of this great group.
And the nucleus of the Suicide Prevention Show, if you would, Mr. Citizen Mike. Citizen Mike, how are you doing, sir?
I could not do this without the rest of you.
Okay.
It's a synergistic thing.
All right, very good.
I love you guys, and I'm so glad to be here with you.
And who do we have visiting with us today?
We have just a phenomenal person here. We have Dr. Diane Semmelhack from the Midwestern University. One of the cool things about this person, other than being an assistant professor, a clinical psychologist, and on the board of directors at NAMI, she has had some unique perspectives on mental illness. And it didn't just start as an adult. And what I'd like you to do, if you'd be willing with our audiences, let's talk about some of those views.
Sure. Well, I'm, an individual adult who had a mother with severe mental illness, and my mother was institutionalized in the 1950s. I'll date myself. I'm 48 years old, but
institutionalized in the 1950s. Do people know what that means today?
Well, it is. It's the Dark Ages. It's cuckoo's nest.
So what did it look like?
It's cold sheets, wrapped in cold sheets. It's a little bit of a whorehouse back then, pre-medication, and individuals. I mean, that was the decade of lobotomies and things like that. I mean, this was an era pre-brain, where we didn't see it as necessarily a brain disorder, and it was a mystery, and nobody knew what it was.
So was there any treatment involved? What was the extent of your mother's treatment? Was there any...
Multiple hospitalizations, not a lot of treatment, not a lot of talk treatment. It was something that the family didn't want to talk about. It was something that I didn't hear about. I just knew Mama went away. Even in the 1960s, Mama would go away for periods of time. Mama would be crying. Mama would be upset. It wasn't until I was, I'd say, 19 years old that I came to the realization that Mama had something very seriously wrong with her that was not as tangible as a tumor. And Mama pointed to her head and said, "I'm afraid that if I look at somebody, I could kill them with my third eye." And I'm like, oh!
Wow.
Yeah.
And you had this going on in your life all that time, 19 years.
Right.
How did you respond to that?
I responded to it by always being fascinated with, I guess, the unconscious. It was like a little bit like growing up in a haunted house, you might say. You never knew what was going to happen. Something was different about our house. Something was different about my mother. And my mother is a very loving, wonderful person, but my mother also suffered greatly and feared stigmatization in the community. And I see now why it became a very silent, sort of undercover family issue, and truly drew me into the field of psychology, because I became very interested in why does Mother have a third eye. And kind of a weird story was, I remember going on a date when I was 26 years old with a psychiatrist, and he goes, "Oh, how's your mother?" And I said, "Well, she's a nice lady, you know." And he goes, "Oh," and he said, "Well, what else about her?" And I said, "Well, she's got a third eye." He goes, "A third eye?" Whoa.
What, did you get a second date?
Then I realized, no.
Things haven't changed
I realized
much.
it was a big deal, you know, and it led me on a journey into understanding the unconscious and understanding the meaning of symptoms and understanding psychopathology from a more humanistic perspective, because my mother's a bright, wonderful, intelligent human being.
But we talk about the secrecy of mental illness, where, again, even within the confines of your own family, you were told not to speak of this.
Yeah, and the family really didn't understand it, you know? I mean, people just, it's not uncommon, and I've talked to a lot of people now that they have somebody who literally suicided in the basement or sat in an apple tree all day. It was Uncle Johnny, and nobody really explained what was going on with Uncle Johnny because nobody wanted the stigma.
You know, I'm really interested in hearing what you have learned and seen about consciousness. When I have worked with people that are diagnosed with schizophrenia or bipolar in the past, I have I have this sense sometimes that some of them actually perceive things that are in our environment that most people just aren't able to perceive. And I think on another show we were talking about what's the difference between being mentally ill and being, very creative. And you're saying that you've had this experience that led you to some sense of consciousness and some views about that. Would you share with us what that sounds like?
Well, I think we think of all things in a very linear way in our society, and that's cause and effect. For every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction. Actually, Newton really did write that, and it's really in a journal. I looked it up. But Aristotle, going way back, looked at different forms of causality, and there's such a thing as final causality, which is what's our purpose in life, and circular causality or formal causality, which would suggest that any given thing in any given moment is created by everything around it. So I guess, I don't know if I'm going off track here a little bit, but my whole purpose, I guess, in getting into these different kinds of causalities was to understand the meaning of symptoms, and that there's a meaning behind mental illness, perhaps, that transcends simply the biological diagnosis.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, because you're talking on another show about these groups that you have formed, but and that is kind of reflected in what you're talking about, kind of this group sometimes. So which of those perspectives do you find to be most closely aligned with your observations among people that are mentally ill?
Well, I guess I like to think that, and this is a little bit provocative statement, but maybe we all have a little bit of a psychotic core. We all have psychotic parts. We all have healthy parts. We all have neurotic parts, and in a group interconnected way, you might look at individuals who pop up as psychotic, pop up with anxiety disorder, etc., as, and this is a little bit more of an esoteric concept, but expressing on the part of the larger group aspects of any given individual in the group. So we have crazy people, so we don't have to own our own craziness.
But we
Does
also
that make
have
sense?
crazy thoughts.
And I hate to say crazy. I don't mean crazy.
No, and that's right.
That's a derogatory term, but unusual.
Because I know when I'll be driving down the road, I've often contemplated what would happen if I swung the car over and drove into that truck. And I'm like, why do I have these thoughts? Where are these thoughts coming from? Yeah. But I remember sharing that with somebody for the first time, because I can't say this to somebody. And they have also had similar, what do we call them, wild or thoughts, unusual thoughts. Yet,
I think,
where does that come from?
Well, I think that's a very interesting thing. And Edgar Allan Poe talked about the imp of the perverse. And the imp of the perverse is, you know what an imp is? It's like a little elf that pops out and it does mischief and all sorts of things. And I think truly, we as human beings all have crazy thoughts, or thoughts that are nonlinear or don't make sense in terms of the context of reality as how we know it. We don't admit to those thoughts.
No.
And the difference is, TD said, wait, where'd that come from?
Right, yes.
Right, and so you're saying where'd that come from instead of acting on it? Or
Exactly.
Right, and so that's an important piece. But the other thing I'm hearing is that all of us have these thoughts or feelings that we experience as kind of bizarre at some level or the other. Now, maybe it doesn't happen frequently, but occasionally many people have these experiences. But what we're finding is, who can you talk to about that stuff?
Right. Well, it becomes quite dangerous to talk to anybody about those things. And those unusual thoughts or unusual ideas, it may be, are the seed to very creative inventions, very genius kinds of ideas. If given a format for mirroring and empathy and some sort of a context in which to form a narrative around those thoughts.
I think that's so important, because I think in terms of people that have invented stuff or helped us, so Newton,
Yes.
and you think of Einstein and the concepts that they have been able to document. I mean, we're bizarre. Columbus, the whole thing, the world is flat, right? And so, but,
Right.
now we know the world is round, but the world has always been round, and we have some people that can perceive those realities. However, they can't speak to other people about it.
Well, it's probably a very far leftist kind of notion, but the idea would be that individuals who have going back to the idea that basically the difference between a mystic and a psychotic individual is the mystic knows who to tell, and the psychotic may tell the wrong person and end up in the hospital. I'm just saying that it's a very fine line. There's a lot of very gifted people with a sense of genius that think a lot differently than the bell curve, the middle of that bell curve. And those individuals can get lost sometimes.
And I think that's so...
Writers, artists, I mean, it's pretty obvious.
Yeah, I think that's so important for us to begin to understand, because we think people talk in terms of what's normal, so that might be in the middle. And yes, we have some people that maybe we would like them to change their behavior, right? It's undesirable. But then we also have these other people that have these thoughts or these feelings or these expressions that are abnormal, and yet at the same time, they're something worth listening to. But oftentimes we silence them instead of listening to them.
And I think you're so right. It would be like someone, let's say, hearing a voice, and hearing that voice for 8 years, and it's a very, very derogatory voice. And it's such a shame to think that somebody might go through life hearing that voice and no one asking, well, whose voice was it? Well, that voice was my grandfather who raped me every weekend. And here we have what might have been perceived to be a, I don't know, schizoaffective disorder or paranoid schizophrenia. And we have an underlying trauma that has not gotten tapped. And in fact, that voice needs to be heard, and that individual needs to tell the story of that voice. It's not just a symptom. The symptom has meaning. The symptom has a metaphoric level to it.
That's fascinating to me, in part because, again, if I were raped by my grandfather, I mean, I could have that voice, that memory, basically, going over my head over and over again, and I wouldn't be able to talk to somebody about it, and that would have some profound influence on my life, particularly if I had the ability to remember and recall above the average person.
Yes, I'd like to, there's a good example of this might be grieving. I know that we've talked a little bit about grieving and what that involves. An individual I'm thinking of in their 80s had not grieved the death of her father at 9 and was unfortunately never given a format to do that, and had all sorts of symptoms that got diagnosed with all sorts of labels. And my God, given an empathic holding environment, we got to some of the voices and to some of the images this person was having that were getting labeled as psychotic, and not to say that they weren't, but they led us to the fact that the person had not gone to their father's funeral, they hadn't been in the room when the father died, that it had been World War II, and the person had been profoundly impacted by the historical context of that war and the loss of a father when a mother became basically poverty-stricken as a result of that loss. So we had a chance to tell that story, and I believe that's important at 80, 90, 100, 50.
What a profound example, because you're saying somebody told this person, be quiet, an adult, told them, shut up, don't talk about that. Yeah. And that lasted 70 years. 70 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like you're saying, there are so many other things that happened over that time period that the woman could associate with the death of her father and remind her of that trauma and never be able to have the opportunity to talk about it.
And I remember this person saying to me, and it was profoundly touching when she said, "Am I allowed to talk about these memories?" Well, unfortunately, a lot of people residing in long-term care are languishing in environments where nobody cares to listen.
Now, Tamara, you do some grief work. Are you, in the grief work that you do, are you kind of seeing this same phenomenon, or is it different?
I am absolutely seeing the same phenomenon. And people who have read my book have come to me and said, this happened to be a 75-year-old woman who said, I lost a baby when I was 18 years old, and I've never ever even spoken of the child because no one wanted to hear it.
And I think about how much energy it must take to suppress these feelings and not to talk about it.
And she was so relieved to be able to. I sat down with her and said, "Tell me about this child. What was his name and how old was he and what was his favorite thing to do, and what was a happy moment you had with this child, and and Di knows this, that just bringing these feelings and these thoughts out, it's very powerful, and I think it's what we're here for.
Yes. Well, it's part of the growth of the human consciousness. I mean, it sounds like a silly little idea going back to the 1970s called the Johari window, but it was Joe and Harry, and they came together, and they had this window, and the window was the self, and they had 4 quadrants, and one quadrant of the self is conscious, one quadrant of the self is known to others but not known to self, and that is blind. Another quadrant is known to others but not known to self, and that is, or known to others and not known to self, and that's hidden. Am I right?
No.
Yes, I think
self and not to others.
Yeah.
Right.
Can I do that again?
Already did.
If we could only draw.
Bottom line is, in the Johari window, there's a quadrant of all of us that is conscious, and that's known to self and known to others. There's a part of everybody that is blind, and that part is known to others but not known to ourselves. That's a blind spot to us. Then there's a part that is known to ourselves that's not known to others, and those are hidden areas, secrets, things we don't want to tell people. And then there's a part not known to self and not known to other, and that's unconscious. That's memories, thoughts that we just block out, or we're not connected to at all. But I think, going back to what you're saying, part of the grieving process, part of working through these psychological symptoms is expanding human consciousness. I know that's something we don't talk about in the,
My conscious self is telling me to take a break, unfortunately, so we have to take a break here. We want to remind people to go to 1360WLBK.com, click on what looks like a stop sign there, and what will magically happen there, Citizen Mike?
Magically, they will be taken to another page. And that won't happen. That will happen with the click of the mouse, not the rug that the woman flies on.
No,
Sorry.
it's actually through the click
All right,
of the mouse.
and they will be able to download this show as well as other shows, listen to archive shows, and they will also be able to email us. Tell us what you think about the show. What do you want to know? Would you like to appear on the show? Let us hear from you, and with your questions or anything else, so that we can help continue changing our world one conversation at a time.
Very good, and we'll be back with more with Dr. Di here in just a moment. You're listening to the 1360 WLBK Suicide Prevention Show here on WLBK.
Every minute, someone in the United States attempts suicide.
Tragically, every 18 minutes, someone succeeds. 90% of people who kill themselves suffer from a mental illness.
It doesn't have to be that way. There is hope. There is the National Alliance on Mental Illness.
NAMI affiliates nationwide help individuals and families touched by mental illness.
Call 1-800-346-4572 or visit our website at il.nami.org.
You are not alone.
Welcome back to the Suicide Prevention Show here on 1360 WLBK. When we last left our group, Citizen Mike had something he wanted to say. Citizen Mike.
Yeah, earlier, Di, you were talking about the Joe Harry window, and it is Joe Harry instead of Joe Hari. But I mean, it took me a while. Yeah, Joe and Harry. I love that story. But part of what that gets at is there are things about me that I know that no one else knows. Yes. No one else knows. Okay, there are things about me that I don't know, but that you know about me.
Right.
And I don't know.
Right.
And then there are things that other people know. And there's a third one, but another piece is those things that nobody knows. Now, part of the thing that we've been talking about on this show is that whole thing in terms of those things that I know about myself, nobody else knows about. In part because some people got a hint of it and told us to be quiet. Yes. Kind of stew with some people for a long period of time, particularly if they're particularly intelligent or if they have some sensibility or some sensitivity or they have great memories or they are good hearers or good seers. And that stays with them a long period of time. I mean, you were talking about 70 years. Tamara was talking about somebody else with another 50 years. The things they know about themselves and no one else knows about them, and they can't talk to others about them. And because we continue to silence them, we're all suffering from that.
Yes, and I really think it's very interesting because particularly with trauma, linear time collapses. When you go to the moment of the trauma, it's as if you're with the 3-year-old, even though you're with the 73-year-old. It's as if you're with the 8-year-old, even though you're with a 50-year-old. And, you know, if you're, at least from my perspective as a psychologist, I can visually see the shift in the person when they go back to revisit the narrative in a very titrated way and to reveal what have for decades in some individuals been tremendous psychological burdens. And you think about carrying a bag of sand around, emotions are the same darn thing.
You know, it's fascinating in part because sometimes people get the view that other people don't know that this is going on. You were talking about this could be esoteric. However, part of the thing I think people don't understand is that the brain is a phenomenal organ. And when I say that, part of what I mean is it encodes billions of bits of information every second, and it remembers a whole lot of them, and I'm not aware of 90% of what my brain remembers. But I can be in a situation a few years from now that can trigger a thought that activates those neural pathways, and all of a sudden it's back to me. And a lot of that has to do with when we silence other people, children, our spouses, our friends, part of what we're doing is we're telling them that what's in their brain, you can't talk about it. And it stays there, and then it kind of messes their brains up.
Right. And the very process of talking it starts firing neurons. Neurons start firing when you start talking about something, telling it in a way and having it listened to. We can't change the past, but by telling the story, we can change our relationship to the past.
Yes, we can change our understanding to the past. We can change our perceptions about the past, our memories.
The past doesn't have us. We have the past.
Absolutely. And you were talking about it being esoteric, but I don't see that.
Common sense.
To me, it is common sense when we understand what we understand today about the brain. Now, certainly you can go way out there if you want to, but part of what we're talking about here is that we have phenomenal organs that are brains. They remember everything. And when we tell people to be quiet about stuff, it doesn't go away.
No.
It stays in that brain until it has a chance to bubble up again.
We can medicate it. And medicate it, but for example, the client I was talking about in her 80s still had the loss of that parent to deal with at age 9. And I don't, you can take tons of Prozac and all sorts of things, but the trauma of that day in August, we'll say, the exact time, the exact moment, the doctor coming with the black bag into the room and the traumatization of the family after that was there.
That phenomenon.
And nobody told it.
The doctor, black bag, those are memories. You're not making the story up. You heard somebody else say that.
I'm protecting the
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, certainly.
Right. But part of the point is that detail stayed with the person for so long. And oftentimes we find ourselves silencing people around those things. And not only that, this can be particularly difficult for people that are brighter and that also might be quiet. Because a lot of times bright people and that are quiet, they do what they're told to do. And part of the problem with them, or part of their challenge, is they're more likely to remember this. There are more other events that are likely to trigger that memory. And part of what we've been talking about is trying to give voice around that.
Right. And giving a person an opportunity, if they're, let's say, presenting in a delusional state as, I don't know, Geronimo, or presenting some symptomatology related to paranoia. What does that mean? And your point earlier, just this idea that in the here and now, the traumatic experience may be triggered, and some of the memories may be encoded pre-verbally. So persons under certain environmental contextual situations might get waves of paranoia or waves of feeling that are related to actual memories, but they can't put them into words.
Yeah, Tamara, I understand that you work with infants and children. Now, do you find those same experiences at Ellie's house?
Yes, I do. And it's, you know what, I don't think that there is an age too young. I have worked with pre-verbal 3-year-olds, actually, and several 2-year-olds that have difficulty telling their story because they don't have the vocabulary to do it with. But through theraplay and that sort of thing, they do tell their story. And in time, they find the words. And when they have the safe environment, like I said before, as Di provides too in her situation, they tell it with greater and greater ease. But the most important thing, though, is to tell the story.
Well, Tamara, that's why it's so important, isn't it, for children when they draw a picture, because they can put so much more into the picture that they're not able to verbalize.
Right, or playing with puppets, or or creating a picture by dictation, or words by dictation. It's very possible, and it's not only that, it's essential to healing. And I always say the best way to get through grief is to go through it. Well, we have more and more evidence of that, and so more and more people are talking about their loss and about their grief. What I love about what Di is doing is that she's now taking that similar model into mental illness and depression and a variety of aspects that I hope it will eventually become the norm to tell your story, that there is a reason why, and it's sometimes in occasions it is chemical, but I'm with Di. I think that what I'm hearing her say is that when you have a trauma in your life, the chemistry in your body is thrown off, and there is a depression based from the challenge or from the event that presses upon you. And when you start to tell the story, the chemistry begins to change. There's an upliftment. Even though it was a difficult story to tell, there is a sense of reconnection and belonging, and you relieve yourself of that isolating feeling. The secret is no longer kept.
We just have just a couple of minutes left. Now, Chuck, you had something you wanted to add.
Yeah, I wanted to just make a statement here when you talk about all these old memories and stuff. My son died about 6 years ago, and I went through a very rough time for a while, and I counseled pretty heavily with a couple different counselors each week. And part of it they thought was some post-traumatic stress syndrome coming back from Vietnam 40 years ago. And I actually had put so much of that in the back of my brain and wouldn't even think about it, but this brought it all up. And I had a pretty difficult time for a while talking about those memories, but it really did help after we got them out and talked about it and moved forward.
It's a very important thing. As we seem to always come back to the same point as speaking out, which Citizen Mike, you emphasize all the time, and then of course Dr. Di, listening, the importance of listening, and you can't put enough emphasis on that, can you?
You can't put enough emphasis on listening, and it's not just grieving physical losses, but grieving lost time in mental illness. People lose decades. People lose careers. People obviously lose people through suicide, but loss has multiple meanings, and putting words to that and having that heard is tremendously healing.
And as we exit here, Dr. Di, somebody going through something like this, so a hidden trauma that went through years and years ago, what do you suggest for these people to do?
Find a good listener.
Okay.
Hopefully a good trained psychotherapeutic ear, a trained ear that can help weave their story together in combination with medication, depending on the individual, but certainly somebody with a good empathic ability to connect with them.
And again, remember that you are the consumer, right? That you're not just a patient,
You are
patient
not,
waiting.
right.
You're the consumer.
You are a consumer of mental health product, and you have a right to find an individual who provides that which you need and you pay for.
Well, Dr. Di, as we say, we're changing the world one conversation at a time, and I know I speak for all of us when we say what a fascinating conversation it's been with you. Thank you for taking time to visit with us, and we look forward to you visiting with us again.
Thank you.
And that's the Suicide Prevention Show for this week.